Hey guys, welcome to the Quiet Past historical channel. Tonight we're diving into one of America's most infamous moments of collective hysteria, the Salem Witch Trials of 1692. So get comfortable, dim those lights, grab your favorite blanket, and settle in. We're going to be here for a while, walking through every bizarre accusation, every questionable confession, and every tragic execution that made Salem Village the poster child for things that should never have happened. This is going to be a long one. We're talking about a community that spent an entire year accusing their neighbors of consorting with the devil, flying on broomsticks, and cursing livestock. Spoiler alert, nobody was actually a witch. But that didn't stop the good people of Salem from hanging 19 people and pressing one unfortunate soul to death under heavy stones. Because once the panic starts, it's really hard to pump the brakes. So let's float back to 1692, to a cold, miserable corner of Massachusetts, where Puritans took their religion very seriously, and their entertainment options were, let's say, limited. This is the story of how a few teenage girls with too much time on their hands accidentally triggered a moral panic that would haunt American history forever. Before we get into the actual trials, we need to understand what Salem Village was like in the late 1600s. And honestly, it was not a fun place to live. Picture this: a small farming community on the edge of civilization, constantly worried about Native American attacks, disease, crop failures, and whether they were sinning hard enough to deserve eternal damnation. The Puritans who settled here weren't exactly the live and let live types. They believed in predestination, meaning God had already decided who was going to heaven and who was going to hell, and there was nothing you could do about it, which seems like it would make people more relaxed. But instead, it made them incredibly anxious and judgmental. They spent an absurd amount of time looking for signs that they were among the saved, and even more time looking for signs that their neighbors were definitely damned. Salem Village, which is now the town of Danvers, Massachusetts, was distinct from Salem Town, the more prosperous port city nearby. Village was basically the poor cousin, full of farmers who resented the wealth and political power of the town merchants. There were land disputes, church disputes, disputes about disputes. The community was already fractured before anyone even mentioned witches. The pastor, Reverend Samuel Parris, had arrived in 1689, and he was not popular. People thought he was too materialistic, too focused on his salary, too obsessed with hellfire and damnation, even by Puritan standards. His sermons were basically, "You're all going to hell" on repeat, which didn't exactly foster warm community vibes. Parris lived in the parsonage with his wife Elizabeth, his 9-year-old daughter Betty, his 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams, and 2 enslaved people he'd brought from Barbados, a man named John Indian and a woman named Tituba. And it's with these people, in the cold January of 1692, that our story really begins. Betty Parris and Abigail Williams started acting strange in January. They had fits. They screamed. They contorted their bodies into weird positions. They complained of being pinched and pricked by invisible forces. They threw things. They babbled nonsense. Basically, they were doing everything that would make a 17th century Puritan think demonic possession rather than bored children or mental health crisis or ergot poisoning from moldy bread. Reverend Paris was understandably alarmed. He called in the local doctor, William Griggs, who examined the girls and came to what was probably the worst possible conclusion. He couldn't find a physical cause for their behavior, so it must be witchcraft. Because when 17th century medicine fails, might as well blame the devil. This diagnosis was basically the match that lit the fuse. Soon, other girls in the village started having similar fits. Ann Putnam Jr., who was 12, started convulsing and claiming to see specters. Elizabeth Hubbard, who was 17 and the niece of Dr. Griggs, joined in. Then 12-year-old Mary Walcott and 20-year-old Mercy Lewis. Before long, there was a whole group of afflicted girls, all having synchronized fits and visions. It was like a very dark, very colonial version of a youth group activity gone wrong. The adults demanded to know who was tormenting these girls, who had sent their specter to pinch them, who had made a pact with the devil. And under enormous pressure, the girls started naming names. The first 3 women accused were about as different as you could get, but they all shared one thing: they were vulnerable. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar with a sharp tongue who went door to door asking for charity and muttering when she didn't get it. She was exactly the kind of person people wanted to blame. Sarah Osborne was elderly, rarely went to church, and had scandalized the community by living with a man before marrying him. She also happened to be involved in a land dispute with the Putnam family, one of the most powerful families in Salem Village. And then there was Tituba, the enslaved indigenous woman from the Caribbean who worked in Paris's household. She was foreign, she was enslaved, and she was the perfect scapegoat. On February 29, 1692, arrest warrants were issued for all 3 women. The next day, they were brought before local magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin for examination. These weren't trials exactly, more like public interrogations designed to get the accused to confess. And this is where things got really interesting, because 2 of the women denied everything, and one of them gave the confession that would fuel months of hysteria. Sarah Good was brought in first. Hathorne, who had apparently already decided she was guilty, asked her why she hurt the children. She said she didn't. He asked what creature she employed to hurt them. She said none. He kept pushing, and she kept denying. Her own husband, William Good, didn't exactly help her case by testifying that she was an enemy to all good, which is maybe not what you want your spouse saying when you're on trial for witchcraft. Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter, Dorcas, would later be accused as well, because apparently the witch panic had no lower age limit. Sarah Osborne also denied everything. She said she was more like to be bewitched than that she was a witch. She hadn't been to church in over a year because she was sick, which the magistrates found suspicious. When the afflicted girls had fits during her examination, writhing and screaming, Osborne seemed confused and frightened. She had no explanation for why these girls would accuse her. She would die in prison 3 months later, never having been formally tried. But Tituba, oh, Tituba gave them exactly what they wanted to hear, and then some. Tituba confessed to everything. She said yes, she was a witch. She said she'd seen the devil, and he appeared to her sometimes as a man, sometimes as a dog or a hog. She said there were other witches in Salem. She said they held meetings, and they had a book, and people signed it. She said Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were with her. She described flying through the air to these meetings. She talked about a tall man from Boston who made her sign the devil's book. She gave detailed, vivid testimony that confirmed every fear the Puritans had about witches operating in their midst. Now, why did Tituba confess to something she almost certainly didn't do? Probably because she was enslaved. She was terrified, and she understood that the two women who denied everything were getting nowhere. Confession, in the twisted logic of the witch trials, was actually the safer path. If you confessed and repented, you might live. If you maintained your innocence, you were clearly lying and unrepentant, which meant hanging. It's worth noting that Reverend Paris had probably beaten Tituba to get information out of her in the days before the examination. So her confession came from a place of absolute vulnerability and fear. But regardless of her motivations, Tituba's confession changed everything. It confirmed that there was a conspiracy of witches in Salem. It meant the hunt had to continue. If there were others, they needed to be found. The magistrates now had justification to keep going, to keep questioning, to keep arresting. And the girls kept having fits. During examinations, they would scream and convulse whenever the accused looked at them. They claimed to see specters tormenting them. They said the witches were pinching them, biting them, trying to make them sign the devil's book. The magistrates took these invisible, unprovable accusations as hard evidence. If the girls said they saw your specter, then your specter was there, and you were guilty. There was no way to defend yourself against it. Martha Corey was the next major target, and her accusation showed that no one was safe. Martha was a church member, a respectable woman who had the audacity to be skeptical about the whole witch panic. She'd reportedly expressed doubt about the afflicted girl's fits. She'd asked reasonable questions, and that made her suspicious, because if you questioned the proceedings, maybe you were trying to protect yourself. Maybe you were a witch. Ann Putnam Jr. claimed that Martha Corey's specter visited her and tried to make her sign the devil's book. When the magistrates brought Martha in for examination on March 21, she tried to defend herself with logic. She pointed out that anyone could be accused of anything by spectral evidence. She said the girls were lying or deluded, but every time she moved her hands or shifted her feet, the afflicted girls mimicked her movements, claiming her specter was controlling them. It was street theater designed to prove guilt, and it worked. Rebecca Nurse was arrested next, and this one really showed how far things had spiraled. Rebecca was 71 years old, hard of hearing, and known throughout the community as a pious, kind woman. She'd been sick in bed when the accusations started, but Ann Putnam Jr. claimed Rebecca's specter was tormenting her, and soon other girls joined in. When Rebecca was examined on March 24, many community members signed a petition defending her character. Even the magistrates seemed uncertain. But the afflicted girls put on such a convincing show of torment that doubt melted away. Rebecca Nurse was sent to jail. Let's pause here for a second to talk about the Putnam family, because they were kind of at the center of everything. Thomas Putnam and his wife Anne Putnam SR were major players in Salem village politics, and they had grievances. They'd lost land disputes. They felt disrespected by Salem town. They'd suffered multiple infant deaths, which Anne SR blamed on witchcraft. Their 12-year-old daughter, Anne JR, was one of the main accusers, and guess what? A lot of the people she accused were connected to the Putnam's enemies. Rebecca Nurse's family had land the Putnams wanted. Martha Corey was allied with families the Putnams didn't like. This wasn't just random accusations. There were social and economic factors driving who got accused and who did the accusing. By April, the jails were filling up. More people were accused every week. The pattern was always the same. The afflicted girls would have fits. They'd name someone. That person would be arrested and examined, and their protestations of innocence would be taken as proof of guilt. Confessing was the only way to avoid immediate execution, but it meant admitting to something you didn't do and often implicating others to make your confession believable. John Proctor and his wife Elizabeth were both accused, which makes sense because John had publicly called the afflicted girls liars. He'd said they should be whipped. He was skeptical and vocal about it, and that made him a target. When he was examined in April, he maintained his innocence. His wife was pregnant, which saved her temporarily, since they wouldn't execute a pregnant woman. But John would eventually hang. Bridget Bishop was one of the more colorful characters to get swept up. She'd been married 3 times. She ran a tavern. She wore flashy clothes by Puritan standards, and she'd been accused of witchcraft before in the 1680s, though nothing came of it. She was exactly the kind of woman Puritans found threatening. Independent, outspoken, not particularly concerned with their rigid social norms. She was accused by multiple people of various acts of witchcraft going back years. She denied everything. It didn't matter. By May, the colonial governor, William Phips, who'd been away in England, returned to find Massachusetts in chaos. He established a special court of oyer and terminer to handle the witch cases. Oyer and terminer means to hear and determine, which sounds official, but basically just meant they were going to rush through these trials as fast as possible. The court consisted of magistrates, including William Stoughton, who became the Chief Justice, and was absolutely convinced that Salem was infested with witches. The court relied heavily on spectral evidence, meaning if an afflicted person said they saw your specter doing something, that was admissible proof. This was controversial even at the time because, as several people pointed out, the devil could presumably take anyone's shape. If the devil could appear as you without your permission, then seeing a specter proved nothing about the actual person. But Stoughton and the other judges didn't care. They were on a mission. Bridget Bishop was the first to be tried under this new court. Her trial was on June 2, 1692. The afflicted girls testified that her specter tormented them. Other witnesses said she'd used witchcraft against them years ago. Someone claimed to have found poppets with pins in them in the walls of her house, which was supposed to be evidence of sympathetic magic. Bridget maintained her innocence throughout. The jury found her guilty. She was hanged on June 10, 1692, on what would become known as Gallows Hill. She was the first execution, but she wouldn't be the last. The trials intensify after Bridget Bishop's execution. There was a brief moment when some people thought maybe they should reconsider this whole spectral evidence thing. Some ministers, including Cotton Mather, wrote a letter urging caution. They said spectral evidence alone shouldn't be enough to convict, though they also said the trials should definitely continue because witches were real and dangerous. So, helpful, but not really. Governor Phipps ignored the advice. Chief Justice William Stoughton definitely ignored it. The Court of Oyer and Terminer kept going at full speed. On June 29, 5 more people were tried: Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. All 5 were found guilty. All 5 were sentenced to hang. Rebecca Nurse's trial was particularly troubling because the jury actually initially found her not guilty. When the verdict was read, the afflicted girls threw fits so dramatic that the judges asked the jury to reconsider. The jury foreman went back to Rebecca and asked her to clarify something she'd said. Rebecca, being elderly and hard of hearing, didn't respond. The jury took her silence as evidence of guilt and changed their verdict. She was now condemned to die. The governor had actually granted her a reprieve at one point because of her age and reputation. But the afflicted girls immediately started having fits again, so he revoked it. Because that's how justice worked in Salem. If teenage girls had seizures, you must be guilty. All 5 women were hanged on July 19, 1692. Sarah Good, standing on the gallows, told Reverend Nicholas Noyes, who urged her to confess, "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard. And if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." Which is honestly one of the most metal things anyone said during the entire ordeal. According to legend, Noyes later died choking on his own blood, though that's probably apocryphal. The trials continued through the summer. More people were accused, more people were arrested, more examinations happened. The jails were overflowing with accused witches. Men, women, children, some as young as 4 years old, were imprisoned in terrible conditions. People died in jail before they even got to trial. On August 5, 6 more people were tried and convicted: George Burroughs, John Proctor, George Jacobs SR, John Willard, and Martha Carrier. Oh, and Elizabeth Proctor was also convicted, but her execution was postponed because she was pregnant. George Burroughs is an interesting case because he was a former minister of Salem Village. He'd left under bad circumstances. There were disputes about his salary, and some people thought he wasn't spiritual enough. He was living in Maine when he was accused, and they had to travel all the way there to arrest him. The accusations against him were particularly wild. People said he had superhuman strength, that he could lift heavy barrels with one hand, which was obviously proof of demonic assistance, and not just that he was strong. The afflicted girls said his specter had tortured them and tried to get them to sign the devil's book. At his execution on August 19, Burroughs did something that almost stopped the proceedings. Standing on the gallows with a noose around his neck, he recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly. This was significant because, according to popular belief, witches couldn't recite the Lord's Prayer without making mistakes. The crowd was moved. Some people started to doubt, but Cotton Mather, the influential minister who'd been supportive of the trials, was present and quickly told the crowd that the devil could quote scripture. So obviously the devil could help someone recite a prayer. The execution proceeded. George Burroughs was hanged, along with John Proctor, George Jacobs SR, John Willard, and Martha Carrier. Martha Carrier had been called the Queen of Hell by Cotton Mather, which seems excessive, but was apparently his thing. She'd been accused by her own children, who'd been imprisoned and tortured until they confessed and implicated their mother. Several of the accused ended up implicating family members under pressure. The authorities would arrest children and threaten them or harm them until they said what the interrogators wanted to hear. By September, the witch hunt had spread beyond Salem Village. People in neighboring towns were being accused. The net kept getting wider. If you had a property dispute with someone, accuse them of witchcraft. If someone insulted you years ago, accuse them of witchcraft. If you just didn't like someone, well, you get the idea. On September 9, 6 more people were tried: Martha Corey, Mary Easty, Alice Parker, Ann Pudeator, Dorcas Hoare, and Mary Bradbury. All were convicted. Mary Easty was Rebecca Nurse's sister, which meant 2 sisters from the same family were being executed for witchcraft. Mary Easty had been arrested, then released when her accusers briefly stopped having fits, then re-arrested when the fits started again, because clearly releasing her had been a mistake. She wrote a petition from jail that's heartbreaking to read. She said she knew she was going to die and accepted it, but she begged the authorities to reconsider their methods because innocent people were being killed. She asked them to listen to the confessors who were saying whatever they had to say to survive, not because it was true. Her petition was ignored. Martha Corey, who way back in March had been one of the first respectable church members accused, was finally going to face execution. She'd maintained her innocence for 6 months in jail. It hadn't helped. 8 people were hanged on September 22, 1692. Martha Corey, Mary Easty, Alice Parker, Ann Pudeator, Margaret Scott, Wilmot Redd, Samuel Wardwell, and Mary Parker. September 22 would be the last mass execution of the trials. But there was one more death, and it's probably the most horrifying one in this whole mess: Giles Corey. Giles Corey was Martha Corey's husband, about 80 years old, a cantankerous farmer who'd lived in Salem Village for years. He was accused in April, not long after his wife. Initially, he'd been one of the people testifying against others, but then he became skeptical of the proceedings, and that made him a target. When it came time for his trial in September, Giles Corey refused to enter a plea. He wouldn't say guilty or not guilty. He just stood there and said nothing. This was a problem for the court because under English law, if you didn't enter a plea, you couldn't be tried. But there was a way to encourage people to enter a plea: pressing. They would lay you on the ground, put a board on your chest, and pile heavy stones on the board until you either entered a plea or died. So that's what they did to 80-year-old Giles Corey. They took him to a field, laid him on the ground, and started piling stones on him. The pressing went on for 2 days. According to legend, every time they asked him to enter a plea, he just said, "More weight." On the third day, September 19, 1692, Giles Corey died. He was crushed to death by stones because he refused to participate in a system he knew was corrupt. There's speculation about why he did this. If he'd been tried and convicted, his property would have been confiscated by the government. By refusing to plead, and therefore never being convicted, his property could pass to his heirs. So maybe he was protecting his family's inheritance. Or maybe he was just a stubborn old man who decided to take a stand in the most dramatic way possible. Either way, it's grim. By October, some people were finally starting to question what was happening. The accusations had gotten increasingly wild. People from prominent families were being accused. The wife of Governor Phipps was accused, which probably helped him realize things had gone too far. When your own wife is suddenly a suspected witch, maybe it's time to reconsider your witch hunting policies. The Reverend Increase Mather, Cotton Mather's father, and one of the most respected ministers in Massachusetts, wrote a treatise called Cases of Conscience concerning evil spirits, in which he argued that spectral evidence was unreliable and shouldn't be used to convict people. He wrote, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned," which seems like common sense, but was apparently a radical position in Salem in 1692. More ministers began speaking out. More prominent citizens expressed doubt. The momentum was shifting. On October 29, Governor Phipps dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer. The special witch trials court was done. There were still about 50 people waiting for trial and more than 100 people in jail, but the execution stopped. In January 1693, a new court, the Superior Court of Judicature, was established to clear the remaining cases. This court did not allow spectral evidence. And shockingly, when you couldn't convict people based on invisible, unprovable accusations, most of them were found not guilty. Of the 52 remaining cases, only 3 people were convicted, and Governor Phipps immediately pardoned them. By May 1693, Phipps issued a general pardon for all remaining accused witches still in jail. But here's a dark twist. Even though people were pardoned, they couldn't leave jail until they paid their jail fees. That's right. You'd been falsely accused of witchcraft, imprisoned for months in horrific conditions, your reputation destroyed, and now you had to pay for the privilege of having been jailed. Some people remained in prison for months after their pardons because they couldn't afford the fees. Some died in jail, waiting for family members to scrape together the money. In total, over the course of 1692 and early 1693, More than 200 people were accused of witchcraft in Salem and surrounding areas. 30 were found guilty. 19 were hanged. 1 was pressed to death. At least 5 died in jail, and untold numbers had their lives destroyed by accusation, imprisonment, and the social stigma that came with being labeled a witch. The aftermath and the blame game. So what happened after the trials ended? Did everyone just go back to normal life and pretend nothing happened? Did they all sit around and wonder how they let things get so out of hand? Well, kind of, but it took a while. Initially, there wasn't a lot of public hand wringing. The people who'd pushed for the trials weren't immediately falling over themselves to apologize, but cracks started to show pretty quickly. The afflicted girls, whose accusations had started everything, mostly just faded into obscurity, and Putnam Jr. would eventually, in 1706, make a public apology in church. She said she'd been deluded by Satan and that she hadn't meant to harm innocent people. She asked for forgiveness. It's worth noting that, by this point, both her parents were dead, so she was an orphan with no one to protect her, and the apology might have been partly about rehabilitating her reputation so she could function in society. She died unmarried in 1716 at the age of 37. Abigail Williams, the other main afflicted girl who lived in Reverend Parris's house, disappeared from the historical record after the trials. We don't know what happened to her. She was only 11 or 12 during the trials, and she may have died young or moved away. Her fate is a mystery. Some of the other afflicted girls got married and lived relatively normal lives, though the community's attitude toward them ranged from sympathetic to suspicious. Were they victims of delusion, or had they knowingly lied? That debate continued for years. Reverend Samuel Parris, in whose house the whole thing started, did not come out of this looking good. His congregation turned against him. People stopped paying his salary. They wanted him gone. Parris tried to defend himself by saying he'd been fighting a real spiritual threat, but not many people were buying it anymore. In 1696, he finally left Salem Village and took positions at various other churches, though he never regained the same level of authority. He died in 1720. Tituba, whose confession had helped fuel the hysteria, remained in jail even after the trials ended because Reverend Parris refused to pay her jail fees. She'd been his slave. He could have paid to get her out, but he didn't. Eventually, someone else paid the fees and purchased her from Parris. She disappears from the records after that. We don't know when or how she died, or whether she ever understood the enormous role her coerced confession had played in everything that followed. The magistrates and judges who'd presided over the trials had mixed responses. Samuel Sewall, who'd been one of the judges, publicly apologized in 1697. He stood in church while a minister read his statement of apology and repentance. He said he wanted to take the blame and shame upon himself for what had happened. He observed a personal day of fasting and prayer every year on the anniversary of the trials for the rest of his life. Say what you want about Sewall, but at least he tried to make amends. William Stoughton, the Chief Justice, who'd been the most aggressive in pushing the trials forward, never apologized. He never expressed any regret. He went on to become acting governor of Massachusetts and lived comfortably until his death in 1701. Some people are just like that. The other judges mostly stayed quiet. John Hathorne, one of the initial examining magistrates, never apologized either. His descendant, Nathaniel Hawthorne, the famous author, was so ashamed of his ancestors' role in the trials that he added a W to the family name to distance himself from it. Cotton Mather, the influential minister who'd supported the trials and written about them extensively, had a complicated relationship with the aftermath. He never fully apologized, but he did try to spin the narrative. He wrote a book called Wonders of the Invisible World that defended the trials and argued that real witches had been operating in Salem. But he also admitted that some mistakes might have been made. Might have. He spent the rest of his life defending his reputation and his role in the trials. Modern historians generally view him as someone who enabled the hysteria through his writings about witchcraft and his endorsement of spectral evidence, even though he'd also cautioned against relying solely on it. In 1702, the Massachusetts General Court declared the trials unlawful. In 1711, the colony passed legislation that restored the rights and good names of those who'd been accused and convicted. It also provided financial restitution to the families of the executed, though notably, not everyone received the same amount. The families had to petition for restitution, and the amounts varied. Some families received substantial compensation, others got very little, and some of the accused, particularly those from marginalized backgrounds, weren't included in the restitution at all. But here's the thing about the aftermath. The formal apologies and legal actions don't fully capture the human cost. Families were destroyed. Children lost parents. Spouses lost each other. People lost their property, their reputations, their place in the community. Some of the accused who survived the trials never fully recovered socially or economically. There were also ripple effects throughout Massachusetts and the other colonies. The Salem trials became a cautionary tale almost immediately. Other communities that had been experiencing their own witch panics pulled back. Connecticut had been having witch accusations around the same time, but after seeing what happened in Salem, they stopped prosecuting. The trials marked the end of the major witch hunting period in colonial America. Interestingly, the trials also contributed to changes in legal standards. The rejection of spectral evidence was significant. The idea that you needed actual, physical evidence to convict someone, not just someone's vision or dream, became more firmly established. The presumption of innocence got stronger. The right to proper legal defense became more valued. In a dark way, Salem helped shape better legal protections, though it's a hell of a way to learn a lesson. Let's talk for a moment about why it happened in the first place, because historians have been debating this for centuries. There's no single explanation, but rather a confluence of factors that created the perfect storm for mass hysteria. First, there's the religious context. The Puritans genuinely believed in witches and the devil as real, active forces in the world. This wasn't superstition to them, it was theology. They believed Satan was constantly trying to corrupt people, and that witches were his servants on earth. They believed in the invisible world as much as the visible one. When strange things happened, witchcraft was a reasonable explanation within their worldview. Second, there's the social and political instability. Massachusetts in the 1690s was dealing with a lot of upheaval. There had been King William's War with the French and their Native American allies, which had brought violence close to Salem. There were refugees from the fighting settling in the area, straining resources. The colony's charter had been revoked and then reinstated with changes, creating political uncertainty. Salem Village itself was in the midst of factional disputes about land, taxes, and church governance. People were anxious and looking for explanations for their troubles. Third, there's the economic angle. Many of the accusers came from families on the losing end of Salem Village's economic changes. The Putnam family, for instance, felt they were being pushed aside by newer, more prosperous families connected to Salem town. A lot of the accused were connected to these rival factions. Witchcraft accusations became a way to settle scores and redistribute power. Fourth, there's the role of gender. The majority of the accused were women, particularly women who didn't fit neatly into Puritan social norms. Women who were outspoken, women who didn't attend church regularly, women who were economically independent, women who'd been married multiple times, women who challenged male authority. The trials reflected broader anxieties about women's roles in society. Fifth, there's the psychological dimension. Some historians have suggested ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on rye and can cause convulsions and hallucinations. Others have pointed to conversion disorder, where psychological stress manifests as physical symptoms. Still others suggest the afflicted girls might have been engaging in deliberate fraud that spiraled out of control. It's probably a mix of genuine psychological distress, social pressure, and yes, some degree of performance. Sixth, there's the legal and procedural failures. The court accepted evidence that would never fly in a modern courtroom. Spectral evidence, touch tests where touching the accused would supposedly stop the fits, the assumption that denial of guilt proved guilt. The accused had no proper legal defense. Confession was the only path to survival, which created an incentive structure that encouraged false confessions and false accusations. And finally, there's the cascade effect. Once the trials started, they created their own momentum. People were afraid to speak out against them because they might be accused themselves. Confessing witches had to name other witches to make their confessions believable. The afflicted girls were getting attention and power they'd never had before, and had incentive to keep it going. The authorities had staked their credibility on the reality of the witch threat and couldn't back down without admitting they'd been wrong. All of these factors fed into each other, creating a situation where rational people became convinced that their community was infested with agents of Satan, and where normal legal and social safeguards completely failed. The people who were lost, let's take some time to talk about the individuals who died because of the Salem Witch Trials. These weren't just names on a list. They were people with lives, families, histories, and they died because their neighbors turned on them. We've already talked about some of them, but let's go through all 19 who were hanged, plus Giles Corey, who was pressed to death. Bridget Bishop was the first to die. She was somewhere between her 50s and 60s, depending on which records you trust. She'd been married 3 times, all her husbands had died, and she ran a tavern. In Puritan New England, a woman running a tavern was already suspect. She wore bright clothes, she wasn't particularly pious, and she'd been gossiped about for years. People claimed she'd bewitched them, made them sick, caused their children to die. None of it was provable. All of it was based on rumor and resentment. She was hanged on June 10, 1692. She maintained her innocence to the end. Rebecca Nurse was 71, deaf, pious, beloved by many in the community. She'd raised 8 children. She'd been a faithful church member. When she was accused, people couldn't believe it. They signed petitions for her. The jury initially found her not guilty, but the judges weren't satisfied. The afflicted girls had their fits, and the verdict was changed. She was excommunicated from the church before her execution, which in the Puritan worldview meant she was damned. She was hanged on July 19, 1692. Sarah Good was the homeless beggar, probably in her late 30s, with a young daughter. Her husband testified against her. Her daughter would later be accused as well. When Reverend Noyes told her to confess at the gallows, she told him he was a liar and cursed him. She was hanged on July 19, 1692. Susanna Martin was in her 70s, from Amesbury, Massachusetts. She'd been accused of witchcraft decades earlier, but acquitted. She had a sharp tongue and didn't suffer fools. When she was examined, she laughed at some of the accusations because they were so absurd. The judges took her laughter as evidence of guilt because apparently joy is suspicious. She was hanged on July 19, 1692. Elizabeth Howe was in her 50s, from Ipswich. She was known for her charity and kindness. Her family tried to defend her. It didn't matter. She was hanged on July 19, 1692. Sarah Wilds was about 65, from Topsfield. She'd been in a property dispute with the Putnam family, which probably didn't help her case. She was hanged on July 19, 1692. George Burroughs was in his early 40s, a former minister of Salem Village. He was living in Maine when they came for him. He was accused of being the ringleader of the witches, which seems unlikely given that he was a minister. But logic wasn't really driving the proceedings. He recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly at his hanging, which should have proved his innocence according to the superstitions of the time. But Cotton Mather convinced the crowd to ignore that. He was hanged on August 19, 1692. John Proctor was in his 60s, a farmer and tavern owner. He'd spoken out against the trials early on, calling the afflicted girls liars. That made him a target. His wife, Elizabeth, was also convicted, but her execution was postponed because she was pregnant. She would eventually be pardoned. But John was hanged on August 19, 1692. His sons were also accused and imprisoned. George Jacobs, SR, was in his 80s, accused by his own granddaughter under pressure. He used 2 canes to walk, which made the accusations that he'd been flying around and tormenting people somewhat impractical. He called the proceedings nonsense. He was hanged on August 19, 1692. John Willard was in his 30s, a farmer. He'd initially served as a constable helping to arrest the accused, but he became troubled by what he was seeing and refused to arrest any more people. So naturally, he was accused himself. He fled but was captured. He was hanged on August 19, 1692. Martha Carrier was in her 40s from Andover. She'd had smallpox and survived, but some people believed she'd spread it deliberately through witchcraft. Her own children were tortured into testifying against her. Cotton Mather called her the Queen of Hell. She was hanged on August 19, 1692. Martha Corey was in her 70s, a church member who'd expressed skepticism about the trials early on. Her husband would later be pressed to death. She was hanged on September 22, 1692. Mary Easty was in her 50s, Rebecca Nurse's sister. She'd been arrested, released, then arrested again. She wrote a moving petition from jail asking the authorities to reconsider their methods because innocent people were dying. She was ignored and hanged on September 22, 1692. Alice Parker was in her 60s from Salem town. Not much is known about her background. She was hanged on September 22, 1692. Ann Pudeator was in her 70s, a widow who'd been married multiple times. People resented her independence and spread rumors about her for years. She was hanged on September 22, 1692. Margaret Scott was in her 70s from Rowley. She was poor and went door to door begging. Like Sarah Good, she was an easy target. She was hanged on September 22, 1692. Wilmot Red was in her 50s or 60s from Marblehead. She'd had a reputation as someone with a sharp tongue who held grudges. Marblehead was a fishing town with its own folk magic traditions, which made people from there slightly more suspect. She was hanged on September 22, 1692. Samuel Wardwell was in his 40s from Andover. He'd initially confessed under pressure, then recanted his confession, which was basically a death sentence. If you confessed and stuck with it, you might live. If you confessed, then took it back, you were definitely going to hang. He was hanged on September 22, 1692. Mary Parker was in her 50s from Andover. She maintained her innocence throughout. She was hanged on September 22, 1692. And then there was Giles Corey, 80 years old, pressed to death on September 19, 1692, because he refused to enter a plea and participate in a system he knew was unjust. Beyond these 20 who were executed, at least 5 people died in jail. Sarah Osborne, Roger Toothaker, Linda Dustin, Ann Foster, and possibly others whose deaths weren't well documented. Sarah Good's infant daughter Dorothy was also imprisoned. She was 4 or 5 years old, kept in chains, and apparently traumatized by the experience. She survived, but was reportedly never the same. These people didn't die because they were witches. They died because their community needed someone to blame for the hardships they were facing, because there were pre-existing grudges and disputes, because the legal system failed, because mass hysteria took hold, and because a few teenage girls either couldn't or wouldn't stop their accusations. The long shadow, the Salem Witch Trials, ended in 1693, but their impact echoed through American history and culture for centuries. In the immediate aftermath, Salem Village was changed forever. The community that had been fractured before the trials was now completely broken. Families were divided between those who'd supported the trials and those who'd been victimized by them. Some people left the area entirely, unable to live in a place associated with such trauma. The village church split. Trust, once destroyed, doesn't easily rebuild. Salem Village eventually changed its name to Danvers in 1752, partly to distance itself from the association with the witch trials. Salem town, which had been less directly involved, kept the name Salem, and ironically became the place most associated with the trials in popular memory. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the Salem Witch Trials became a go-to reference for mob justice, mass hysteria, and the dangers of religious extremism. When people wanted to criticize overzealous prosecution or public panic, they'd invoke Salem. The trials got a significant cultural boost from literature. Nathaniel Hawthorne, descendant of Judge John Hathorne, wrote about Salem extensively, most notably in The House of the Seven Gables. His work helped keep the memory of the trials alive in American consciousness and explored themes of inherited guilt and the sins of the past. In the 20th century, the Salem Witch Trials became a metaphor for the anti-communist hysteria of the McCarthy era. Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible in 1953, a play set during the Salem trials, but clearly commenting on the House Un-American Activities Committee and the blacklisting of suspected communists. Miller himself had been questioned about his political beliefs. The parallel was obvious. Both involved accusations that were hard to disprove. Both created an atmosphere where people would accuse others to save themselves. Both relied on guilt by association, and both destroyed lives based on spectral evidence. If someone says you're a communist or a witch, how do you prove you're not? The Crucible has been performed countless times since then, and it's become the primary way many people learn about the Salem Witch Trials, which is interesting because it's a work of fiction that takes substantial liberties with the historical record. For instance, in the play, John Proctor and Abigail Williams have an affair, which is used to explain her accusations. In reality, John Proctor was 60 and Abigail Williams was 11, so that affair definitely didn't happen. But the play captures something true about the dynamics of hysteria, even if the specific details are fictionalized. The trials have been invoked in discussions of other moral panics throughout American history. The Satanic Panic of the 1980s and 90s, where people were convinced that satanic ritual abuse was happening in daycares across the country. The recovered memory movement that led to false accusations, various episodes of mass hysteria in schools and communities. Anytime there's a rush to judgment, anytime accusations become proof of guilt, anytime communities turn on their own members based on fear rather than evidence, someone will invoke Salem. Salem itself has had a complicated relationship with its history. For a long time, the town tried to downplay the witch trials because they were embarrassing. But by the mid-20th century, Salem realized there was money in the story. The town began leaning into its witchy reputation. Today, Salem is a major tourist destination, especially in October leading up to Halloween. There are witch museums, witch shops, witch tour. The commercialization is surreal when you think about what actually happened there. 19 people were executed, and now you can buy T-shirts about it. Some people in Salem find the commercialization distasteful, arguing that it trivializes a real tragedy. Others point out that the tourism brings in revenue and keeps the history alive, even if it's in a somewhat kitschy form. There's now the Salem Witch Trials Memorial, dedicated in 1992 on the 300th anniversary of the trials, which treats the subject with appropriate solemnity. It's a simple but moving space with stone benches inscribed with the names of the executed and the dates of their deaths. Descendants of the accused and the accusers still live in the area, and for some of them, the trials are personal history. In 2001, Massachusetts formally exonerated 5 of the accused who hadn't been included in earlier exonerations. In 2022, the last of the accused were formally cleared, 329 years after the trials ended. The trials have also been studied extensively by historians, sociologists, and psychologists trying to understand how mass delusions take hold. What makes a community turn on itself? How do rational people become convinced of things that seem absurd in retrospect? What are the warning signs of moral panic? One thing that's clear is that the Salem witch trials weren't an aberration. They were an extreme example of something that happens repeatedly in human societies: the scapegoating of vulnerable people during times of stress. The specific form changes. The accusations change, but the underlying dynamic, where fear and social pressure override reason and evidence, that keeps happening. The trials remind us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary cruelty when they're scared, and when they're given social permission to act on that fear. The judges, magistrates, and ministers who pushed the trials weren't monsters. They were educated men who genuinely believed they were protecting their community from a supernatural threat. The accusers weren't all malicious liars. Some were probably genuinely experiencing psychological distress that they interpreted through the lens of their religious beliefs. The community members who supported the trials weren't evil. They were people living in a harsh world, looking for explanations for their suffering. But good intentions and sincere beliefs don't make the outcome any less tragic. 19 people were hanged, One was crushed to death. Others died in prison. Families were destroyed. And it all could have been stopped at multiple points if people had been willing to question the proceedings, to demand better evidence, to show mercy. The Salem Witch Trials stand as a warning about what happens when fear overrides justice, when accusations become proof, when we stop seeing the accused as fully human. The specific details are historical, but the lesson is timeless. The broader context of witchcraft accusations to really understand Salem. It helps to know that it wasn't an isolated incident. Witch hunts had been happening in Europe for centuries before Salem, and they'd happened in colonial America before 1692, just not on the same scale. The European witch hunts, particularly between 1450 and 1750, resulted in an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 executions, though some historians put the number higher. Germany was particularly zealous. In some regions, entire villages were nearly wiped out. The methodology was similar to what would later happen in Salem. Accusations, confessions often obtained through torture, trials with dubious evidence, and executions usually by hanging or burning. The witch hunts in Europe were tied to religious conflicts, social upheaval, and economic changes. The Protestant Reformation had fractured Christian unity, and both Catholics and Protestants were eager to prove their piety by rooting out evil. There were wars, plagues, and famines, and witchcraft provided a convenient explanation. The publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, in 1487, provided a pseudo-intellectual framework for identifying and prosecuting witches. Most of the accused in Europe were women, particularly older women, widows, healers, midwives, or anyone who was socially marginal. The misogyny was blatant. The Malleus Maleficarum explicitly stated that women were more susceptible to the devil's influence because they were morally weaker than men. England had its own witch hunts, though they were somewhat less intense than on the continent. English witches were typically hanged rather than burned. The most famous English witch hunter was Matthew Hopkins, the self-proclaimed Witchfinder General, who was responsible for hundreds of executions in the 1640s. His methods included sleep deprivation, forcing accused women to walk until they collapsed, and searching for witches' marks on their bodies. When Puritans came to America, they brought these beliefs with them. But for the first several decades of settlement, witch accusations in New England were relatively rare. There were cases, particularly in Connecticut, but nothing approaching the scale of what would happen in Salem. Between 1647 and 1663, about 15 people were executed for witchcraft in New England. The cases tended to involve women who were seen as troublesome, quarrelsome, independent, or economically autonomous. The trials were more restrained than what would happen in Salem, partly because colonial authorities were more cautious about such accusations. So what changed by 1692? Part of it was timing. The earlier restraint had broken down. The colony was under more stress, and crucially, the authorities in 1692 made the fateful decision to accept spectral evidence, which earlier courts had been more skeptical about. It's also worth noting that Native American communities had their own beliefs about witchcraft and sorcery, though these were quite different from European concepts. The colonists' wars with Native Americans fed into their fears about the devil's presence in the wilderness. There was a racialized element to Puritan anxieties about the devil. The forest where Native Americans lived was seen as the devil's territory. This is part of why Tituba, an indigenous woman from the Caribbean, was such an easy first target for accusations. She represented multiple sources of Puritan anxiety. She was a woman. She was enslaved. She was from outside their community. And she was associated with the non-Christian world. After Salem, witch trials in America effectively ended. There were a few scattered accusations in the following decades, but authorities refused to prosecute them seriously. The disaster of Salem had made witch hunting politically and legally untenable. In Europe, the witch hunts also wound down in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, though the last legal execution for witchcraft in Europe didn't happen until 1782 in Switzerland. The Enlightenment brought new ways of thinking about evidence, causation, and the natural world that made witchcraft accusations seem less credible. But belief in witchcraft didn't disappear entirely. Even today, there are communities around the world where people believe in witchcraft and where accusations can lead to violence. The dynamics are similar: social stress, marginalized victims, and a community looking for someone to blame for misfortune. The psychological and social dynamics. Let's dig deeper into how the Salem Witch Trials actually functioned on a psychological and social level, because this is where it gets really interesting and also deeply unsettling. First, there's the role of the afflicted girls themselves. Modern psychologists have proposed various explanations for their behavior. Some suggest conversion disorder, a condition where psychological stress manifests as physical symptoms. The girls were living in a repressive society with limited outlets for expression. Their fits gave them attention, sympathy, and power they'd never had before. Think about it. These were mostly young women and girls with very little social standing in Puritan society. They were supposed to be seen and not heard, obedient, submissive. Suddenly, when they had their fits, adults paid attention to them. Magistrates asked them questions. Their words could send people to jail or to the gallows. That's an intoxicating amount of power for someone who normally has none. There's also the possibility of what's called social contagion. When one person in a group displays certain symptoms, others may unconsciously begin displaying them too. We see this in various historical cases of mass hysteria: dancing plagues in medieval Europe, laughing epidemics in African schools, cases of mysterious illness in modern factories. Once a few people start having fits, others join in, partly through suggestion and partly through social pressure. Some historians have suggested the girls might have been deliberately faking from the start, though this seems less likely. It's hard to maintain that level of performance consistently over months. More probably, it started with genuine psychological distress, or perhaps experimentation with fortune-telling that got out of hand, and then escalated as the girls realized the power they had. There's a credible theory that some of the girls might have been engaging in folk magic practices they'd learned from Tituba, and when they were caught or felt guilty about it, they deflected by claiming they'd been bewitched. This would explain why the accusations started in Reverend Paris's household, and why Tituba was one of the first accused. The adults' response is equally fascinating from a psychological perspective. They saw what they expected to see. The Puritans believed witchcraft was real, so when the girls had fits, witchcraft was the obvious explanation. Confirmation bias kicked in hard. Once you believe someone is a witch, everything they do can be interpreted as evidence of witchcraft. The judges and magistrates were particularly susceptible to this. They'd staked their authority on the reality of the witch threat. Admitting they were wrong would mean admitting they'd imprisoned and executed innocent people. So they doubled down. This is a classic example of escalation of commitment. The more you invest in a course of action, the harder it becomes to change course, even when evidence suggests you should. The community dynamics are also crucial. Salem Village was already divided into factions before the trials. The trials became a way to settle old scores. Notice how many of the accused were connected to families that had disputes with the accusers' families. Martha Corey was allied with families the Putnams didn't like. Rebecca Nurse's family had land the Putnams wanted. George Burroughs had left under bad circumstances with debts unpaid. The trials also reinforced social hierarchies. Most of the accused were people on the margins: poor women, independent women, people involved in disputes, people who didn't conform to social norms. By contrast, when the accusations started reaching up the social ladder to the wives of prominent men, the trials suddenly became less credible to those in power. There's also the role of fear. Once the trials were underway, speaking out against them was dangerous. If you questioned whether the accused were really witches, you might be accused yourself. Several people who tried to defend the accused or express skepticism found themselves arrested. This created a climate where dissent was impossible. Even people who privately doubted what was happening stayed silent to protect themselves. The confessors provide another fascinating case study. Why would anyone confess to something they didn't do? The answer is survival. As the trials progressed, a pattern became clear. Those who confessed and cooperated lived. Those who maintained their innocence were hanged. Confessing was the rational choice if you wanted to survive, even if it meant lying. But confessing came at a cost. You had to give details. You had to name other witches. The authorities wouldn't accept a simple, "Yes, I'm a witch." You had to tell them about meetings, about the devil, about who else was there. This meant implicating others, dragging more people into the nightmare. Some of the confessions are clearly fabricated, full of impossible details and contradictions. But the authorities accepted them because they confirmed what they wanted to believe. The confessions reinforced the narrative of a vast conspiracy of witches operating in Salem. There's also the question of why the trials ended when they did. Partly it was that the accusations had become too widespread. When prominent people and their families were being accused, the elite began to question the process. When the wife of Governor Phipps was accused, suddenly the governor had a personal stake in shutting things down. But there was also exhaustion. The trials had gone on for months. The jails were full. The executions had shocked many people. Even those who believed in witchcraft were starting to wonder if maybe things had gone too far. The influential minister's warning about spectral evidence gave authorities cover to change course. The end of the trials shows the importance of institutional checks on hysteria. When respected voices began questioning the proceedings, when the colony's leadership decided to change the rules of evidence, the trials collapsed quickly. This demonstrates that while mass hysteria is powerful, it's not unstoppable. Institutions and leaders have the power to end it if they choose to. Examining the key players more closely, let's look more carefully at some of the people who shaped the Salem Witch Trials, beyond just the victims. Samuel Parris, the minister in whose home the afflictions began, is a complicated figure. He was born in London in 1653, but spent time in Barbados, where his father owned a plantation. He tried being a merchant, but failed at it, then turned to ministry. He arrived in Salem Village in 1689, and his tenure was controversial from the start. Parris was obsessed with his salary and the perks of his position. He demanded ownership of the parsonage and more firewood than previous ministers had received. He preached hellfire sermons that made his congregation uncomfortable. His leadership style was authoritarian. By 1692, a significant portion of his congregation wanted him gone. When his daughter and niece started having fits, Parris initially tried to keep it quiet, possibly because he recognized how problematic it would be. But once the accusations became public, he threw himself into the witch hunt with enthusiasm. His sermons during 1692 were full of references to the devil's presence in Salem. He encouraged the trials. He testified against several of the accused. After the trials, Parris tried to defend himself, but his congregation turned against him completely. He was forced to apologize, though his apology was weak, and focused more on defending his actions than expressing genuine remorse. He left Salem Village in 1696 and never held a position of similar authority again. Thomas Putnam and his wife Anne Putnam, S.R., were central to the accusations. Thomas was from one of Salem Village's founding families, but by 1692, the Putnams felt their influence waning. They'd lost land disputes. They resented the growth of Salem town. They felt disrespected. Thomas Putnam served as a scribe during many of the examinations, recording the proceedings. His wife, Anne S.R., was one of the adult afflicted, having visions and fits alongside the younger girls. Their daughter, Anne J.R., was one of the primary accusers. The Putnams had experienced significant loss. Anne S.R. had given birth to multiple children who died in infancy. she seems to have believed that witchcraft was responsible for these deaths. Her grief and anger found an outlet in the witch trials. Many of the people accused had connections to the Putnam family's enemies. The geographic pattern of accusations maps closely onto the factional divisions in Salem Village, with the Putnams and their allies as accusers and their rivals as accused. After the trials, Thomas Putnam signed a petition supporting Reverend Parris, but later turned against him. Anne Putnam S.R. died in 1699, and J.R. S. 1706 apology was notable, but it's worth remembering that by that point, she was an orphan with little power, and the apology may have been pragmatic as much as genuine. William Stoughton, the Chief Justice of the Court of Oyer and Terminer, was arguably the person most responsible for the scale of the executions. Stoughton was a wealthy man, Harvard-educated, who'd served in various political positions. He was appointed to lead the special court established to handle the witch cases. Stoughton was a true believer in the witch conspiracy. He accepted spectral evidence without question. He pushed for convictions. When the jury initially found Rebecca Nurse not guilty, he pressured them to reconsider. He showed no mercy and expressed no doubt. After the trials, Stoughton never apologized, never expressed regret, never acknowledged that innocent people had been executed. He went on to serve as acting governor and died wealthy and respected in 1701. His lack of remorse is particularly striking, given how many others involved in the trials eventually expressed at least some doubt about what they'd done. Cotton Mather is perhaps the most complicated figure associated with the trials. He was only 29 in 1692, but already one of New England's most influential ministers, the son of Increase Mather, Harvard-educated, prolific writer. Mather believed in witchcraft. He'd written about it extensively before Salem. His book, Memorable Providences, relating to witchcrafts and possessions, from 1689, described a case in Boston and was likely read by the Salem accusers. Some historians argue that Mather's writings helped create the climate that made the Salem panic possible. During the trials, Mather's role was complex. He attended the execution of George Burroughs and gave a speech defending the proceedings. He wrote Wonders of the Invisible World, which supported the trials. But he also signed the letter cautioning against relying solely on spectral evidence. After the trials, Mather tried to defend his actions while also distancing himself from the worst excesses. He never fully apologized, but did acknowledge that mistakes were made. He spent the rest of his life defending his reputation against critics who blamed him for the trials. Modern historians are divided on Mather's culpability. Some see him as a key enabler whose writings and influence helped create the panic. Others argue he was more ambivalent, and that his warnings about spectral evidence were ignored. What's clear is that his influence was significant, and that he never fully reckoned with the human cost of the trials he supported. John Hale, the minister from nearby Beverly, was initially a strong supporter of the trials. He testified against several of the accused, but his attitude changed when his own wife was accused. Suddenly, Hale began to question whether the proceedings might be flawed. After his wife was accused, but before she was arrested, the trials ended. In 1697, Hale wrote a modest inquiry into the nature of witchcraft, which was a careful critique of the trials. He acknowledged that innocent people had been executed. He expressed regret for his role. His change of heart demonstrates how perspective shifts when you or someone you love becomes a target. Mary Warren deserves special attention. She was a servant in the Proctor household and initially one of the afflicted girls. But when her employers, John and Elizabeth Proctor, were accused, Mary testified that she'd been faking her fits and that the other girls were lying too. The other afflicted girls immediately turned on her, accusing her of witchcraft. Mary was arrested. Under pressure, she recanted her confession that she'd been lying and rejoined the accusers, testifying against the Proctors. This episode reveals the intense social pressure to conform and the impossibility of standing up to the accusers once the trials were underway. The evidence they used, one of the most disturbing aspects of the Salem Witch Trials, is the types of evidence that were accepted as proof of witchcraft. Let's break down what actually counted as evidence in these proceedings. Spectral evidence was the most controversial and ultimately the most deadly form of evidence. This was testimony that someone had seen the accused person's specter or spirit performing acts of witchcraft. For instance, an afflicted girl might say, "I see Goody Corey's specter pinching me," even though Goody Corey was physically standing across the room. The logic, such as it was, went like this: witches could send their specters to torment people at a distance. Therefore, if someone testified that they saw your specter doing something evil, you must have sent it, and therefore you were a witch. The fact that the specter was invisible to everyone except the afflicted person didn't matter. The testimony of the afflicted was taken as sufficient proof. The problem, which several people pointed out at the time, was that this made it impossible to defend yourself. You couldn't prove you hadn't sent your specter somewhere. You couldn't provide an alibi because your physical location was irrelevant. The accusation itself became the evidence. Even more concerning, some theologians argued that the devil could take on the appearance of innocent people without their permission. If that was true, then seeing someone's specter proved nothing about whether they were actually a witch. But the Salem court chose to believe that the devil wouldn't impersonate the innocent, a convenient assumption that made convictions much easier. The touch test was another form of evidence. The theory was that if a witch touched their victim, the bewitchment would be broken, at least temporarily. So during examinations, they would sometimes have the accused touch the afflicted girls. If the girls' fits stopped when touched, that was evidence of witchcraft. Of course, the girls controlled whether they stopped convulsing or not. It was performative evidence that proved nothing except that the girls would respond to the expectations placed on them. Physical evidence was sometimes presented, though it was usually ambiguous at best. They searched accused witches' homes for Poppet's dolls that might be used for sympathetic magic. Finding a doll with pins in it was considered evidence, though many households would have had dolls or cloth figures for perfectly innocent reasons. They searched accused witches' bodies for witches' marks, or devil's marks, unusual moles, birthmarks, or skin tags that supposedly indicated where the devil had touched them or where their familiar spirits would suckle. Basically, any skin irregularity could be interpreted as a witch's mark. Since most people have some kind of mole or birthmark, this was easy evidence to find. Confessions were considered the best evidence, which is why so much pressure was put on the accused to confess. A confession could be obtained through various means: sleep deprivation, prolonged interrogation, threats, or promises of mercy. Once someone confessed, they were expected to provide details and name other witches. The authorities seemed unconcerned that confessions obtained under duress might be unreliable. They also didn't seem bothered by the obvious incentive structure they'd created, where confessing and implicating others was the only way to survive. Preternatural evidence involved things like unexplained deaths of livestock, sudden illnesses, or crop failures that occurred after an argument with the accused. If you'd had a dispute with someone and then your cow died, that could be evidence that the person had cursed you. This type of evidence relied on post hoc ergo propter hoc reasoning. If B happened after A, then A must have caused B. It ignored all other possible explanations for misfortune and reduced everything to personal malevolence. Witness testimony about the accused's character or past actions was also used. If you'd had a reputation for being quarrelsome, if you'd been accused of witchcraft years ago, if people thought you were weird or antisocial, all of that could be used against you. Sarah Goodmuttering, as she walked away from houses where she'd been denied charity, was presented as evidence of cursing. Bridget Bishop's clothing choices and tavern keeping were used to paint her as immoral and therefore likely a witch. The recitation test was based on the belief that witches couldn't properly recite prayers or scripture. George Burroughs famously disproved this by reciting the Lord's Prayer perfectly at his execution. But Cotton Mather argued that the devil could have helped him, so it didn't matter. This inconsistency in how evidence was interpreted is telling. Evidence that supported a conviction was accepted readily. Evidence that might exonerate was explained away. The behavior of the afflicted during examinations was treated as evidence. If the girls had fits when the accused looked at them, that was evidence. If the girls mimicked the accused's movements, that showed the accused was controlling them. If the girls screamed when the accused denied the charges, that proved the accused was lying. Basically, anything the afflicted girls did was interpreted as confirming the accusations. There was no behavior that could exonerate the accused. What's striking about all of this is how the evidentiary standards were set up to guarantee convictions. There was no neutral position. You couldn't prove you weren't a witch. Maintaining innocence was evidence of guilt because it meant you were unrepentant. Confessing was evidence of guilt because, well, you confessed. The only question was whether you'd confess and save yourself or maintain innocence and hang. This is what happens when legal proceedings are divorced from reasonable standards of evidence, when belief trumps proof, when accusation equals guilt. The forms of a trial were maintained, but the substance of justice was absent. Life in Salem prison. Let's talk about what it was like to be imprisoned during the witch trials, because the executions weren't the only suffering inflicted. When someone was accused of witchcraft, they were arrested and taken to jail. The primary holding facilities were in Salem Town, Ipswich, and Boston. These weren't modern prisons. They were dark, cold, filthy places designed to hold people temporarily before trial, not for long-term incarceration. Prisoners were kept in chains. Heavy iron shackles were placed on wrists and ankles. For some prisoners, especially those deemed particularly dangerous, i.e., those who maintained their innocence most vocally, neck irons were also used. Imagine being shackled for months in these conditions. The cells were small, dark, and unsanitary. There was no heat in winter. Prisoners provided their own food or went hungry. Families had to bring food to their imprisoned relatives or pay the jailer to provide it. If you had no family or your family was too poor, you starved. Disease was rampant. People died of illness before they ever made it to trial. Sarah Osborne, one of the first 3 accused, died in Boston prison on May 10, 1692. She was never tried. Roger Toothaker died in Boston prison on June 16. Anne Foster died in prison on December 3. These are just the deaths that were recorded. There were likely others. Remember Sarah Good's daughter, Dorcas? She was about 4 years old when she was arrested and imprisoned. She was kept in chains. A 4-year-old child in chains in a dark cell, separated from her mother, who was in another part of the prison. Dorcas's mother, Sarah, was executed on July 19. What was it like for that child, who probably didn't understand what was happening, traumatized by imprisonment and then losing her mother? Dorcas survived and was eventually released, but according to later testimony, she was permanently affected by the experience. Her father said she was never mentally sound after her imprisonment. We would probably diagnose her with severe PTSD today. Pregnant women were kept in prison, but not executed until after giving birth. Elizabeth Proctor was convicted, but her execution was postponed because she was pregnant. She gave birth in prison in January 1693, after the trials had ended. Can you imagine giving birth in those conditions? Cold, dark, unsanitary, still in chains. The prisoners who confessed were kept alive, but still imprisoned. Tituba confessed in March 1692 and remained in prison for more than a year. Samuel Parris refused to pay her jail fees, even though she was his slave, and her confession had been partly to avoid his beatings. She was finally released when someone else paid to purchase her from Paris. And yes, jail fees were a thing. You had to pay for your imprisonment. You had to pay for your chains. You had to pay for your food. When you were found not guilty or pardoned, you couldn't leave until these fees were paid. Margaret Jacobs confessed under pressure, then recanted. She was eventually pardoned, but couldn't leave prison for months because her family couldn't pay the fees. Some families were financially ruined by the trials. Not only did they lose the labor of the imprisoned family member, but they had to pay for their keep in prison and often pay for legal fees as well. If the accused was convicted, their property could be confiscated. Families were left destitute. The psychological torture of imprisonment was compounded by the uncertainty. You didn't know if you would be tried next week or next month. You didn't know if you'd be convicted or acquitted. You didn't know if confessing would save you or if maintaining innocence would lead to execution. Every day in those cells must have been agony. The treatment of prisoners also varied depending on their social status and whether they'd confessed. Those who confessed and cooperated were treated somewhat better. Those who maintained innocence were treated more harshly. Giles Corey was pressed to death in part because he refused to cooperate with the proceedings at all. The jailers were not sympathetic. They were functionaries carrying out orders, and in some cases, they profited from the prisoners. The more prisoners they held, the more fees they collected. They had no incentive to be kind or to advocate for better conditions. Children imprisoned with their parents witnessed things no child should see. They saw their parents in chains, in despair, sometimes dying. They experienced imprisonment themselves. The trauma rippled through families and generations. When the trials finally ended and pardons were issued, the physical release from prison didn't mean release from the consequences. People returned to communities that had turned on them. Their reputations were destroyed. Their property was often gone. Their health was broken. The chains might come off, but the scars remained. The ones who got away, not everyone accused in Salem was convicted or executed. Some people were accused, but never arrested. Some were arrested, but never tried. Some were tried and acquitted. Some managed to escape. Let's talk about those who survived. Tituba, as we've mentioned, confessed and was kept alive. She spent over a year in prison before being sold off. Her ultimate fate is unknown, but she survived the trials themselves. Dorcas Good survived, though at tremendous psychological cost. She was released from prison eventually and lived into adulthood, but was reportedly never mentally sound after her childhood imprisonment. Elizabeth Proctor was convicted, but her pregnancy saved her life. By the time she gave birth in January 1693, the trials were over and she was pardoned. She eventually remarried and had more children. Her husband John had been executed. Her family's property had been confiscated, but she survived and rebuilt her life. John Alden was a sea captain from Boston who was accused in May 1692. His high social status helped him, but he was still arrested and imprisoned. He managed to escape from jail and fled to New York. He stayed there until the trials were over, then returned home. He was never punished for his escape because by the time he returned, the authorities wanted to forget the whole thing happened. Philip English and his wife Mary were both accused. They were wealthy merchants from Salem town. They managed to escape from jail with help from friends and fled to New York. Their property was confiscated while they were fugitives. After the trials ended, they returned, but Philip English spent years trying to recover his financial losses. He never fully did. He remained bitter about what had been done to him, and refused to forgive those involved, including Reverend Paris. Mary Bradbury was convicted and sentenced to hang, but she also managed to escape from prison. She was 77 years old at the time. She hid with the help of friends and family until the trials were over. She lived for several more years after the trials ended. Several accused witches fled before they could be arrested. When you heard that someone had named you, the smart move was to get out of Salem as quickly as possible. The authorities issued warrants, but didn't always pursue fugitives aggressively, especially as the trials wore on and doubt increased. Some people were accused, but the authorities never moved forward with their cases. As the trials progressed and more prominent people were accused, the court became more selective about which cases to pursue. When the governor's wife was accused, that was a turning point. Obviously, the accusations had gone too far if they were reaching the colony's elite. Margaret Jacobs, granddaughter of George Jacobs SR, was accused and confessed under pressure. She implicated her grandfather and others, but then she recanted, saying her confession had been false and driven by fear. She wrote a heartbreaking letter explaining why she'd lied, saying that she'd been told confessing was the only way to save herself and that she couldn't bear the psychological torture anymore. Her recantation put her in danger of execution, but by the time her case came up, the trials were ending. She was pardoned, but she had to live with having accused her grandfather, who was executed partly based on her testimony. The guilt must have been immense. Many of those who confessed lived, but they lived with the knowledge that they'd lied and often implicated others to save themselves. Some of these confessors later recanted and apologized, acknowledging that their confessions had been false. Others maintained their confessions for years, perhaps unable to admit even to themselves that they'd lied. The people who maintained their innocence and survived were mostly those whose cases were delayed until after the special court was dissolved. When the Superior Court of Judicature took over in 1693 and stopped accepting spectral evidence, most of the accused were acquitted. But by then, 19 people had already been hanged. Some of the survivors were broken by their experiences. Imprisonment, the loss of family members, financial ruin, and social stigma took their toll. Others showed remarkable resilience, rebuilding their lives, and in some cases becoming vocal critics of what had been done. The survivors carried the memory of the trials for the rest of their lives. They knew they'd come close to execution for something they hadn't done. They'd seen friends and neighbors turn on them. They'd experienced the fragility of justice and the power of fear. The minister's role, the Puritan ministers of Massachusetts, played a crucial role in the Salem Witch Trials, and their legacy is complicated. Let's examine how the theological and moral leaders of the community contributed to what happened. Samuel Parris, as we've discussed, was the minister in Salem Village where it all began. His sermons in 1692 were filled with rhetoric about the devil's presence in Salem. He preached that Satan was actively working to corrupt the community. He told his congregation that witches walked among them. His fire and brimstone style created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Paris fully supported the trials. He testified against several accused witches. He framed the trials as a spiritual battle between good and evil. He never questioned whether the accusations might be false. After the trials, when his congregation turned against him, he wrote a Meditations for Peace in which he offered a weak apology, admitting that he might have been mistaken, but not acknowledging the full horror of what had happened. Cotton Mather was the most influential minister in Massachusetts in 1692, even though he wasn't directly involved in Salem Village. His writings about witchcraft before the trials helped create the intellectual framework that made the trials possible. His book, Memorable Providences, relating to witchcrafts and possessions, from 1689 was widely read and included detailed descriptions of possessed children and the witches tormenting them. When the trials started, Mather corresponded with the judges and attended at least one execution. His response to George Burroughs's perfect recitation of the Lord's Prayer before his hanging, explaining it away so the execution could proceed, was a crucial moment. Without Mather's intervention, the crowd might have stopped the execution. After the trials, Mather wrote Wonders of the Invisible World, which defended the proceedings and argued that real witches had been operating in Salem. He included testimony from the trials and framed it as a battle between God's people and Satan's servants. The book was published in October 1692, while some of the accused were still in jail waiting for trial. But Mather also signed the minister's letter in June 1692 that cautioned against relying solely on spectral evidence. So he was simultaneously supporting the trials and warning about their methods. This contradiction characterized his involvement. He wanted the witches caught, but was uncomfortable with how it was being done. Yet he never used his considerable influence to stop the trials. Increase Mather, Cotton's father, and an even more respected minister, was initially less involved. He was in Boston dealing with the colony's charter issues, but as the trials progressed, he became increasingly concerned. In October 1692, he wrote Cases of Conscience concerning evil spirits, which argued strongly against the use of spectral evidence. Increase Mather wrote, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned." This principle, now known as Blackstone's ratio, was a direct challenge to the trial's methodology. His treatise was read to Boston ministers and signed by 14 of them, creating institutional pressure to end the trials. Increase Mather's intervention was significant, but it came late. By October 1692, 19 people had been executed. His caution helped end the trials, but it didn't save those who'd already died. Nicholas Noyes was the minister in Salem town and was heavily involved in the proceedings. He attended the examinations and executions. He urged the condemned to confess. Sarah Good's curse, "If you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink," was directed at him. He never apologized for his role and apparently believed to the end that the trials had been justified. Deodat Lawson had been minister of Salem Village before Samuel Paris. He returned to visit in March 1692 right as the accusations were ramping up. He gave a sermon about the devil's attacks on the community. He witnessed the afflicted girl's fits during services and wrote an account of what he'd seen. His descriptions helped spread word of what was happening in Salem and added credibility to the accusations. Other ministers throughout Massachusetts watched what was happening in Salem with a mixture of concern and support. Some quietly expressed doubts, but didn't speak out publicly. Some actively supported the trials. Very few spoke against them before they were over. The minister's role is particularly significant because they were the moral and intellectual authorities of Puritan society. What they said about the devil, about witchcraft, about spiritual warfare shaped how their congregations understood the world. When they said witches were real and present in Salem, people believed them. When they supported the trials, people thought the trials must be justified. But the ministers were also trapped by their own theology. They'd preached for decades about the devil's reality and power. They'd written books about witchcraft. They'd told their congregations to be vigilant for signs of Satan's influence. When the accusations started in Salem, backing down would have meant admitting they'd been wrong about fundamental theological principles. This created a kind of institutional momentum. Once the ministers supported the trials, it was hard to change course. Their authority was invested in the reality of the witch threat. Questioning the trials meant questioning themselves. After the trials, most ministers tried to distance themselves from what had happened without fully repudiating their beliefs about witchcraft. They might acknowledge that mistakes were made, that perhaps some innocent people were convicted, but they maintained that witchcraft was real and that the devil was active in the world. They tried to have it both ways, acknowledging error without abandoning the worldview that made the error possible. The theological framework of Puritanism, with its emphasis on the devil's power, predestination, and the spiritual warfare between good and evil, created the conditions for the witch hunt. But it was specific ministers making specific choices that turned theological beliefs into legal proceedings and executions. The economic factors, while the Salem Witch Trials are often discussed in terms of religion, psychology, and social dynamics, there were also significant economic factors at play. Let's follow the money. Salem Village was an agricultural community, while Salem Town was a prosperous port. This geographic and economic division created tension. The farmers of the village resented the merchants of the town. They felt they were working harder for less reward, while the town merchants grew wealthy from trade. Within Salem Village itself, there were divisions between those with better land and those with worse, those with connections to Salem Town's economy and those who were purely agricultural. The Putnam family, which was central to the accusations, represented the old agricultural elite that felt its influence waning. Many of the accused had some kind of property or economic independence that made them threatening to the patriarchal property system. Women who owned property, especially women who'd inherited it or gained it through multiple marriages, were disproportionately accused. Sarah Osborne, one of the first three accused, was involved in a property dispute with the Putnam family. family. Her husband had died, and she'd married an indentured servant, which scandalized people. More importantly, she was trying to control her late husband's property in a way that the Putnams thought was improper. Accusing her of witchcraft was convenient for those who opposed her property claims. George Jacobs, SR, was a wealthy man who owned substantial property. His accusers included some of his own family members who stood to inherit if he was convicted and executed. Since convicted witches' property was confiscated, there were financial incentives for some accusals. Rebecca Nurse's family had property that neighboring families coveted. The land disputes in Salem Village were long-standing and bitter. Witchcraft accusations became a way to resolve these disputes in favor of the accusers. When someone was convicted of witchcraft, their property was supposed to revert to the government, which could then distribute or sell it. In practice, this meant that families of the convicted lost everything. Even if you were acquitted or pardoned, the costs of imprisonment and legal defense could bankrupt you. Sheriff George Corwin was responsible for confiscating property from convicted witches. He was aggressive about it, sometimes taking more than was legally justified. After the trials, some families sued to recover property that had been improperly seized. Philip English, the wealthy merchant who'd fled to avoid execution, spent years in legal battles trying to recover what had been taken. The jail fees we've discussed were also an economic factor. Jailers charged for everything: for the chains, for the cell space, for food. These fees added up quickly. Some families went into debt paying to keep their imprisoned relatives alive. The fact that you had to pay to leave even after being pardoned meant that poor people stayed imprisoned longer than wealthy people. There was also the cost of legal defense, though the legal defense available was minimal. Accuseds could hire attorneys, but attorneys were limited in what they could do. The deck was stacked against the accused. Still, wealthier accused witches had more resources to fight the charges or to flee and hide until the trials ended. The economic disruption to Salem Village was substantial. With so many people imprisoned, farms went unattended. Crops weren't planted or harvested. Labor was lost. Families were economically devastated. The social fabric of the community was torn apart, and economic relationships were destroyed. Some historians argue that the trials were partly driven by economic anxiety. Massachusetts, in 1692, was dealing with economic uncertainty. The colony's charter had been revoked and then reinstated with changes. There were questions about land titles and property rights. King William's War had disrupted trade and caused economic hardship. In times of economic stress, people look for someone to blame. The witchcraft accusations provided scapegoats. If your crops failed, or your children died, or your business struggled, it wasn't just bad luck or economic forces beyond your control. Someone had cursed you. Someone was malevolently causing your problems. And if you could identify that person and have them removed, maybe your fortunes would improve. The pattern of accusations also followed economic and political fault lines. The accusers were generally from families that were struggling economically or losing political influence. The accused were often from families that were prospering or from rival factions. There were exceptions, but the pattern is there. After the trials, Salem Village's economy was damaged. The village's reputation was destroyed. People were reluctant to settle there or do business there. The community split even further, and eventually Salem Village changed its name to Danvers to escape the association. The financial restitution paid by the colony in 1711 didn't come close to compensating for what families had lost. Some families received a few pounds. That doesn't make up for lost property, lost labor, lost years of a breadwinner's life, lost reputation, and lost sense of security. The economic dimensions of the trials remind us that witch hunts don't happen in a vacuum. They're shaped by material conditions and economic interests, property disputes, debt, economic competition, and class tensions, all fed into who was accused and who was believed. Women and the trials, the Salem Witch Trials, were overwhelmingly gendered. Of the accused, about 80% were women. Of those executed, about 75% were women. This wasn't an accident. Let's examine why women were targeted and what the trials reveal about gender in Puritan New England. Puritan society had very clear ideas about women's roles. Women were supposed to be subordinate to men, to their fathers before marriage and their husbands after. Women were supposed to be quiet, obedient, focused on domestic duties. They were considered more susceptible to sin than men because of Eve's role in the fall. Theology painted women as spiritually weaker and more easily corrupted by the devil. The women most likely to be accused shared certain characteristics. They were poor, they were old, they were widowed, they were outspoken. They didn't attend church regularly. They were involved in disputes. They had reputations for being difficult or angry. They were economically independent, or they challenged male authority in some way. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar who muttered angrily when denied charity. She was exactly the kind of woman Puritans found threatening. Poor, outside male protection, not properly deferential. Sarah Osborne rarely attended church and had scandalized people by living with a man before marrying him. Bridget Bishop ran a tavern, wore colorful clothes, and had been married 3 times. All of these women violated norms about how women should behave. But it wasn't just women on the margins who were accused. Rebecca Nurse was a pious church member, but she was old and deaf, and those very facts made her vulnerable. Martha Corey was also a church member, but she'd expressed skepticism about the trials, which made her threatening to those invested in them. The accusations often had a sexual dimension, even when not explicit. Women were accused of attending midnight meetings with the devil. The devil was often described in masculine terms. The relationship between witch and devil was sometimes framed in terms that suggested sexual submission. Women who signed the devil's book were, in a sense, pledging themselves to him instead of to God or to their husbands. The afflicted girls themselves were mostly young women and girls on the cusp of adulthood. In Puritan society, would soon be expected to marry and submit to male authority. Their fits and accusations gave them power in a society that otherwise denied them power. When they spoke, adults listened. When they pointed, people were arrested. It was an intoxicating reversal of normal power dynamics. Some historians have interpreted the afflicted girl's behavior through the lens of repression and rebellion. These were young women living in an intensely patriarchal society with very limited options for their futures. Their fits might have been a form of protest, conscious or unconscious, against the constraints placed on them. The fact that adult women like Anne Putnam, SR, also had fits and visions suggests this wasn't only about youthful rebellion. Adult women in Puritan society also had limited power and faced intense pressure. Witchcraft accusations became a way for women to express grievances and exercise agency in a society that otherwise silenced them. But we shouldn't romanticize this. The afflicted girls and women weren't feminist heroes. Their accusations destroyed lives. Many of the people they accused were women more vulnerable than themselves. The trials weren't women rising up against patriarchy. They were women participating in a system that oppressed other women. The treatment of accused women during examinations was often humiliating. They were searched for witches' marks on their bodies, an invasive procedure carried out by other women under the direction of male authorities. They were subjected to public spectacle, with their fits and the accuser's performances turning examinations into theater. The women who confessed often had to describe themselves in degrading terms, admitting to consorting with the devil, signing his book, attending his meetings. They had to present themselves as having been seduced or coerced by Satan, reinforcing the idea that women were weak and easily corrupted. Men were also accused, and several men were executed. George Burroughs, John Proctor, George Jacobs, SR, John Willard, and Samuel Wardwell were all hanged. Giles Corey was pressed to death. But men were more likely to be accused if they were connected to accused women, husbands, relatives, defenders, or if they had challenged the trials directly. Men who were accused often faced different accusations than women. George Burroughs was accused of having superhuman strength, of being the leader of the witches. He was framed as a masculine threat, not just a corrupted soul. John Proctor was accused after he vocally denounced the trials and the afflicted girls. The trials reinforced patriarchal power, even as they temporarily disrupted it. Yes, young girls were suddenly powerful. Yes, women's testimony was taken seriously in ways it usually wasn't. But ultimately, male authorities decided who lived and who died. Male judges, male magistrates, and male ministers controlled the proceedings. Women's power in the trials was contingent and temporary, a brief and chaotic moment before order was reasserted. After the trials, there was no sustained empowerment of women in Puritan society. The afflicted girls grew up and took their places in the patriarchal order, marrying and subordinating themselves to husbands. The trials didn't change women's structural position in society. If anything, they reinforced the idea that women needed to be controlled and monitored. The gender dynamics of the trials reflect broader anxieties about women's power and place. Witchcraft accusations were often directed at women who violated norms. Women who were too independent, too outspoken, too sexual, too angry, too old, too poor, or too different. The trials became a way to police women's behavior and punish those who stepped out of line. The slow reckoning as we wind down this incredibly long journey through the Salem Witch Trials. Let's talk about how the story ended not with a bang, but with a slow, uncomfortable reckoning. The trials officially ended in May 1693 with Governor Phipps's general pardon, but the aftermath stretched for years. The immediate response was silence. Many people involved wanted to pretend it hadn't happened. There was shame, guilt, fear. How do you process the fact that you participated in killing your neighbors based on spectral evidence? In 1696, a group of Salem village residents submitted a petition asking Reverend Samuel Parris to leave. They wrote, "We know not how we may recommend that precious and great ordinance of the Holy Supper of the Lord unto your hands, considering that those who were so condemned and executed may as good right in the eye of man to that ordinance as we yourself had, till you can clear yourself from that great evil of shedding the blood of the innocent." In other words, you presided over the killing of innocent people, so how dare you now offer us communion? That same year, the Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting and repentance for the trials. This was a collective acknowledgement that something had gone terribly wrong. Judge Samuel Sewall stood in church while his apology was read. He took full blame upon himself, which was both admirable and perhaps a bit of evasion. He was one man in a system that had many participants. In 1697, several jurors from the trials signed a statement admitting they were sadly deluded and mistaken and asking for forgiveness. They wrote, "We do therefore hereby signify to all in general and to the surviving sufferers in especial our deep sense of and sorrow for our errors in acting on such evidence to the condemning of any person." This was significant. These men admitted they were wrong. They asked forgiveness. But again, words on paper don't bring back the dead. And Putnam Jr.'s 1706 apology was particularly moving. She stood in church while a minister read her statement. She said she had been an instrument for the accusing of several persons of a grievous crime, whereby their lives were taken away from them, whom now I have just grounds and good reason to believe they were innocent persons. She blamed Satan for deluding her, which was convenient. It allowed her to admit error without taking full personal responsibility. But at least she apologized. Most of the other afflicted girls never did publicly. In 1702, the Massachusetts General Court declared the trials unlawful. In 1711, it passed legislation that reversed attainders, essentially clearing criminal records for many of the accused and providing financial restitution. But not everyone was included. Some of the accused had to petition multiple times. Some never received restitution. The amounts paid were arbitrary. Elizabeth Proctor's family received £150. Rebecca Nurse's family received £25. Why the disparity? No clear reason. Some families received nothing because they didn't know to petition or couldn't navigate the bureaucracy. The social wounds took longer to heal. Families that had been divided by the trials remained divided. Some people never forgave those who'd accused their relatives. Philip English, the wealthy merchant who'd fled and lost his property, never forgave anyone involved, including Reverend Paris. He refused to pay church taxes and fought legal battles for years. Salem Village itself never fully recovered. The community was poisoned by what had happened. The factions that had existed before the trials were now even more bitter. In 1752, the town changed its name to Danvers, partly to escape the association with the trials. For individuals, the trauma lasted lifetimes. Those who'd been imprisoned carried physical and psychological scars. Those who'd lost family members grieved. Those who'd participated in the accusations carried guilt, whether they acknowledged it or not. The trials became a cautionary tale almost immediately. Other colonies that had been experiencing witch panics pulled back. Massachusetts stopped prosecuting witchcraft cases. The legal standards changed, with spectral evidence rejected and better protections for the accused implemented. But belief in witchcraft didn't disappear. Plenty of people in New England continued to believe in witches and the devil well into the 18th century. What changed was the willingness to prosecute and execute based on those beliefs. The law and the culture shifted, even if individual beliefs did not. The historical memory of the trials has evolved over centuries. In the immediate aftermath, it was something to be ashamed of and forgotten. By the 19th century, it became a story about Puritan fanaticism and the importance of Enlightenment rationality. In the 20th century, it became a metaphor for political persecution and moral panics. Each era reinterprets Salem through its own concerns. The McCarthy era saw it as a story about baseless accusations and destroyed lives. The 1990s, during the Satanic Panic, saw parallels with false accusations about ritual abuse. Today, we might see it as a story about social media mobs or cancel culture, or any situation where accusation becomes indistinguishable from guilt. The descendants of those involved have had to reckon with their ancestry. Descendants of the accused have worked to clear their ancestors' names fully. Some accused witches weren't officially exonerated until 2001, and the last wasn't cleared until 2022. Descendants of the accusers and judges have had to come to terms with what their ancestors did. Nathaniel Hawthorne, descendant of Judge John Hathorne, was so ashamed of his ancestor that he changed the spelling of his family name and explored themes of inherited guilt in his writing. Other descendants have done genealogical research, written books, participated in memorial ceremonies. The Salem Witch Trials Memorial, dedicated in 1992, is a quiet, solemn place. Stone benches are inscribed with the names of the executed and the dates of their deaths. It's adjacent to an old cemetery where some of the accusers are buried. The juxtaposition is intentional, a reminder that victims and perpetrators lived side by side. In recent years, there's been increased attention to the trial's broader context. Scholars have explored connections to colonialism, racism, and slavery. Tituba's role as an enslaved indigenous woman has received more attention. The trials are now understood not just as a religious or psychological phenomenon, but as part of the larger history of how European colonists treated indigenous peoples and enslaved people. The story of the Salem Witch Trials doesn't have a clean ending. There's no moment where everything was fixed or everyone forgave each other. It's a messier story of slow, incomplete reckoning. Some people apologized. Some never did. Some wounds healed. Some didn't. Justice was partially achieved, but never fully. Memory was preserved, but also distorted. What remains is a warning that echoes through centuries. Be careful what you believe. Question authority. Demand evidence. Protect the vulnerable. Don't let fear override reason. Don't participate in the destruction of innocence, even if everyone around you is doing it. Stand up for justice, even when it's difficult and dangerous. 19 people were hanged. One was pressed to death. Others died in prison. Countless lives were destroyed. And for what? There were no witches in Salem. There never had been. There was only fear and the terrible things humans do when they're afraid. Closing, so here we are, after more than 22,000 words, at the end of our journey through the Salem Witch Trials of 1692. We've walked through every accusation, every examination, every execution. We've met the victims, the accusers, the authorities, and those caught in between. The Salem Witch Trials lasted less than a year, but their impact rippled through centuries. They stand as one of the darkest moments in American colonial history, a time when fear and faith combined with social tensions to create a perfect storm of injustice. 20 people were executed, hundreds were accused, thousands were affected, and no one was actually a witch. It's a story about how quickly things can go wrong when we abandon reason, when we let fear guide our actions, when we fail to protect the vulnerable, when we value conformity over justice. It's a story about the dangers of spectral evidence, both the literal kind that was used in Salem and the metaphorical kind that we still sometimes accept, accusations based on invisible, unprovable claims. It's also a story about human nature, about how ordinary people can do terrible things, about how social pressure can override individual conscience, about how institutions can fail, about how power can corrupt, about how trauma echoes through generations. But maybe, if we're lucky, it's also a story that teaches us something. That makes us more skeptical of moral panics. That makes us more protective of due process. That makes us more willing to stand up when we see injustice, even if it's popular or sanctioned by authority. The people of Salem in 1692 weren't monsters. They were people like us, living through difficult times, trying to make sense of a confusing world, making choices based on their beliefs and their fears. They made terrible mistakes. They caused immeasurable harm, and they had to live with that. We should remember their victims: Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Good, George Burroughs, John Proctor, Martha Corey, Mary Easty, and all the others who died protesting their innocence. We should remember Giles Corey, crushed under stones because he refused to participate in an unjust system. We should remember the children imprisoned, the families destroyed, the community torn apart. And we should remember that the question isn't whether we would have acted differently in 1692. The question is whether we'll act differently when we face our own moments of moral panic, our own pressure to conform, our own opportunities to either pursue justice or participate in injustice. The Salem Witch Trials ended in 1693, but the lessons they teach us are timeless. Thanks for staying with me through this long, dark story. I hope it helps you sleep well, or at least helps you think deeply. Rest well and remember, there were no witches in Salem. There never were.